My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 32 years old, and 3 hours ago my father told me to clear out my office by the end of the day. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. We were standing in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the warehouse floor of Mercer Industrial Supply, the company my grandfather started in 1978 with one delivery truck and a rented storage unit. My father stood at the head of the table, hands flat against the polished wood, and said, calm as ever, "You're no longer part of this company, Daniel. I'll have HR send the paperwork." Just like that. 21 years of walking those floors. 14 years of working there. Yeah, I paid for myself because he said I'd appreciate it more. And now I was an outsider looking in at a building that still had my last name on the front. Before I tell you how I ended up standing in that parking lot with a cardboard box and no job, let me take you back 8 months to the last real conversation I had with my grandfather. It was late October, a Tuesday. The kind of gray afternoon that makes everything look a little older than it is. I was at my desk reviewing quarterly inventory numbers when my phone buzzed. Grandpa. He didn't call during business hours unless it mattered. "Danny," he said when I answered, his voice rougher than I remembered. "Hey, Pop. You okay?" "Fine enough," he replied, which was never a direct answer. "You busy? For you?" "Never." He chuckled at that, a dry sound that turned into a cough he tried to hide. "Come by tonight. Not the house. The office." That caught my attention. "The office? The old one," he clarified. "Upstairs. Bring the spare key." The old office was a converted loft above the original warehouse on Cedar Street. We'd moved operations years ago, but Grandpa kept the space like a shrine. Old ledgers, framed photos, his first invoice taped crookedly to the wall. "I'll be there," I said. When I walked up those narrow wooden stairs that night, I could smell dust and machine oil, the scent of my childhood. Grandpa was sitting at the small metal desk he'd used for decades, a banker's lamp casting a pool of yellow light over stacks of paper. He looked smaller. That's the first thing I noticed. Not frail exactly, but reduced somehow, like the world had been quietly trimming him down. "You're losing weight," I said before I could stop myself. "So are you," he shot back. "That stress is eating you alive." I tried to smile, but he was right. The company had been under pressure all year. Larger distributors were undercutting prices. Supply chain delays were strangling our margins. My father, CEO since 2005, had started making decisions that felt desperate. Aggressive expansion. Risky credit lines. A second warehouse we didn't fully need. "Sit," Grandpa said, nodding to the chair across from him. I sat. He studied me for a long moment, not in a casual way, in a measuring way. "You still want this?" he asked. "Want what?" "The company." The question felt heavier than it should have. "It's not about wanting," I said carefully. "It's our responsibility." He leaned back slowly. "That's not what I asked." I thought about the early mornings on loading docks, about knowing half our employees by name, about watching my father turn conversations into commands. "Yes," I said finally. "I want it, but not like this." Grandpa nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a manila envelope. Thick, worn at the edges. He didn't hand it to me. He set it on the desk between us. "Things change when I'm gone," he said. The air in the room shifted. "You're not going anywhere," I said too quickly. He ignored that. "Your father's good at building, not as good at protecting, and he's not good at sharing." I said nothing. "I've taken care of something," he continued. "But I need you to do one thing for me." My chest tightened. "Anything. Whatever happens, don't walk away." He tapped the envelope with 2 fingers. "What is it?" I asked. "You'll know when you need to." That was Grandpa. Direct and cryptic at the same time. I reached for the envelope. He put his hand on top of it. Not yet. We sat there in silence for a full minute, just the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner and the distant sound of traffic outside. "Promise me," he said. "I promise." That was the last night I saw him at the office. 2 months later, he was in the hospital. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. By January, he was gone. The funeral was held in a small chapel on Maple Avenue, closed casket, snow lining the sidewalks. I remember the sound my father made when the casket was lowered, a short, strangled inhale like he'd been punched. For the first few weeks after, we were united in grief. Then the tension started. The first board meeting without Grandpa felt wrong. He had always sat at the head of the table, not because he demanded it, but because everyone naturally looked to him. Now my father sat there. He began restructuring immediately, consolidating authority, revising voting rights. "We need agility," he said. "No more drawn-out consensus." I tried to raise concerns about cash flow, about over-leveraging. He cut me off mid-sentence. "I appreciate your input, Daniel," he said, tone flat. "But this isn't a classroom exercise." The room went quiet. That was the first time he spoke to me like that in front of the board. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next few months, he slowly sidelined me, meetings rescheduled without notice, emails I was removed from, clients reassigned. When I confronted him privately, he waved it off. "You're emotional," he said. "You and your grandfather were too close. You're not thinking strategically." "I'm thinking long-term," I replied. "So am I." But we weren't thinking the same way. In May, he finalized a deal to acquire a struggling competitor across state lines. I told him the numbers didn't justify the risk. He signed anyway. In June, payroll was tight. In July, he took out a personal loan using company assets as collateral. I found out by accident. That's when we had the fight. "You had no authority to question that decision," he snapped in his office. The door closed. "I'm CFO," I shot back. "That's literally my job." "You're my son first," he said. There it was. The hierarchy. Family over function. Obedience over accountability. "And if those conflict?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "Then you remember who built this." "The implication hung between us, not you." The next morning, I was called into the conference room. He didn't yell. He didn't insult me. He simply said, "This isn't working." And just like that, I was out. Security watched while I packed my things. 32 years old, unemployed, locked out of the company my grandfather had built and I had bled for. I drove home in silence. And that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I remembered the envelope. The one in the old office. I still had the spare key. The next morning, before the warehouse opened, I drove to Cedar Street. The old building looked the same. Faded brick, rusted fire escape, the sign barely hanging on. Inside, dust floated in the early light. I climbed the stairs slowly, half expecting the door to be locked. It wasn't. The office smelled exactly the same. The envelope was still in the bottom drawer. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a contract, dated 12 years earlier. Signed by my grandfather, signed by me, and signed, most importantly, by my father. I didn't remember it at first. Then it hit me, the summer I turned 20. Grandpa had insisted we formalize succession planning. He called it protecting the bloodline from ego. The document was simple but powerful. It established that upon the death of founder Thomas Mercer, 51% of voting shares would transfer into a controlling trust. The sole trustee, Daniel Mercer. Effective immediately upon founder's death. Irrevocable. My father retained operational authority as CEO, but ultimate voting control belonged to the trust. Belonged to me. There was also an addendum. If the CEO engaged in financial actions that materially endangered the company, including leveraging company assets for personal loans without trustee approval, the trustee had authority to remove the CEO by board vote. I sat down hard in Grandpa's old chair. My father had signed it. I could see his signature at the bottom. Younger. More fluid. He must have assumed it would never matter, or that I'd never use it. Under the contract was a letter. "Danny, if you're reading this, it means your father forgot something important. This company doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to the people who built it and the people who depend on it. If he pushes you out, don't push back in anger. Push back in responsibility. And remember, leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about protecting what matters when no one else will." Love, Pop. I don't know how long I sat there, but I knew one thing. I wasn't done. 3 days later, I requested an emergency board meeting. My father tried to block it. He couldn't, because the trust agreement had been filed with the company attorney 12 years ago, and it was airtight. When we gathered in that same glass conference room where he'd fired me, the air felt electric. He looked tired, angry, confused. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly before the meeting started. "No," I replied. "I'm correcting one." I presented the contract, the trust, the loan documentation, the risk analysis. No theatrics, just facts. By the end of the meeting, the vote was unanimous. He was removed as CEO, not as my father, but as the head of Mercer Industrial Supply. He didn't speak to me as he walked out. I didn't stop him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. 6 months later, the company is stable again. We sold the second warehouse, restructured the debt, rebuilt relationships. I kept him on as a consultant. That was my choice. We don't have dinner every Sunday anymore. But we talk. Slowly. Carefully. Some days I wonder if I should have let it go. If blood should matter more than contracts. What would you have done? If your parent forced you out of something you helped build, would you walk away? Or would you fight to protect it? I never wanted control. I wanted responsibility. And sometimes those come wrapped in the same envelope. 3 months after I removed my father as CEO, he walked into my office without knocking and told me I was about to lose everything. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply closed the glass door behind him, sat down across from my desk and said, "You think you won, Daniel? You have no idea what you've triggered." There's something different about a calm warning. It lingers longer. Before I tell you what he meant by that, and what I found out 2 weeks later, let me take you back to the first board meeting after I officially stepped into the role. It was August. The heat outside made the warehouse air feel heavy, metallic. I remember wiping my palms on my slacks before walking into the conference room that now technically belonged to me. Same long oak table, same city skyline through the glass, different seat at the head. No one applauded. This wasn't a movie. It was quieter than that. Cautious. The kind of silence people hold when they're not sure whether to congratulate you or resent you. Linda from operations gave me a small nod. Mark, our logistics director, avoided eye contact. And at the far end of the table sat my father. Not as CEO, as Senior Strategic Advisor. A title I created to soften the blow. Maybe that was my first mistake. "I want to start by saying something clearly," I told the room. "Nothing about this transition changes our mission. We stabilize. We protect cash flow. We don't gamble." I felt my father's eyes on me the entire time. Unblinking. The next few weeks were methodical. We sold the underperforming warehouse, renegotiated supplier contracts, froze hiring. I worked 18-hour days and still drove home wondering if I had overcorrected. Then subtle things started happening. 2 longtime managers resigned within 10 days of each other. A vendor we'd worked with for 15 years suddenly declined to renew. A rumor circulated that I had forced my father out for personal gain. I didn't need to ask who planted it. One afternoon, I walked into the break room and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. That's when you know a narrative is forming without you. Have you ever walked into a room that used to feel like yours and realized you're being measured instead of trusted? That's what those weeks felt like. At home, it wasn't easier. My mother stopped calling. Family group texts grew shorter. My aunt sent me a message that simply read, "I hope you know what you're doing." I told myself this was temporary, that results would speak louder than loyalty. Then, in September, the letter arrived. Certified mail. From a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice of intent to challenge the trust. Grounds, undue influence and coercion at the time of signing 12 years earlier. My father had hired litigation counsel. I sat in my office staring at the document while the late afternoon sun turned the windows orange. He wasn't going after my authority as CEO. He was going after the foundation itself. If the trust was invalidated, control would revert to him. Just like that. I called our company attorney, Rebecca Hall, who had been with us almost as long as Grandpa. She listened quietly while I read the notice aloud. "Are you surprised?" she asked. "No," I admitted. "But I thought he'd accept it." "Daniel," she said gently, "men who build empires don't surrender them easily." The next month became a blur of depositions, document requests, old financial records pulled from storage, and then something surfaced that I hadn't known. 12 years ago, the year the trust was created, the company had nearly collapsed. There had been a private line of credit, personally guaranteed by my grandfather, that my father had extended beyond safe limits. If that loan had been called, Mercer Industrial would have folded. Grandpa stepped in quietly, paid it down, restructured it, saved the company. And the trust? It had been drafted 3 months later, not as a random succession plan, as a safeguard. When I realized that, something inside me shifted. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about pattern. The hearing was scheduled for late November. Cold rain streaked the courthouse windows that morning. My father stood across the hall from me in a charcoal suit, speaking in low tones to his attorney. He looked older than I remembered, smaller, but his posture was rigid. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled like old paper and wood polish. The judge was efficient, direct. My father's attorney argued that at 20 years old, I couldn't have fully understood the implications of the trust agreement. That my grandfather had manipulated me into signing something that shifted power unfairly. I listened without reacting. Then Rebecca stood. She presented the financial records from that year, the overextended loan, the restructuring, my grandfather's personal funds used to stabilize the company. She presented meeting minutes where my father acknowledged risk. And then she introduced something I hadn't known existed, a recorded statement. 12 years ago, when the trust was signed, Grandpa had recorded a video with the company attorney present. It had been archived with the legal documents. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. There he was, younger, stronger, sitting in that same old Cedar Street office. "If you're watching this," he said into the camera, "it means someone's questioning why I put control in Danny's hands." He leaned forward. "This company survived because someone was willing to say no when it mattered. My son builds fast, too fast, and sometimes pride blinds him. Daniel doesn't have that flaw, not yet, so I'm balancing the scales." My father's jaw tightened. Grandpa continued, "This isn't punishment, it's protection. And if my son ever challenges this, I hope he remembers I did it to keep him from destroying what he loves." The video ended. The courtroom was silent. The judge ruled 2 weeks later. Trust upheld. Case dismissed. When the decision came through, I was alone in my office. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. That's when my father walked in and told me I had no idea what I'd triggered. Now you know why. But that wasn't the end. 2 days after the ruling, our largest client, a national construction chain, announced they were terminating their contract with us. No warning, no negotiation. 40% of our annual revenue gone in a single phone call. I drove straight to their headquarters, sat in a lobby for 3 hours until their procurement director agreed to see me. "We've been advised to reconsider long-term stability," she said carefully. "Advised by who?" She didn't answer directly. But she didn't have to. My father had relationships I didn't. Deep ones, over dinners, golf games, decades. He couldn't win in court, so he moved the battlefield. That night, I didn't sleep. I ran projections until 3 a.m. If we didn't replace that revenue within 6 months, layoffs were inevitable. The next morning, I called an all-hands meeting. I stood on the warehouse floor where I'd worked as a teenager, forklifts parked behind me. "We lost a major contract," I told them plainly. "It's a hit, a big one. But we're not folding." I laid out the plan. Diversification, regional expansion, direct outreach to mid-size contractors. No corporate jargon, just reality. Afterward, Mark, the logistics director who had avoided my eyes for months, approached me. "Your dad would have kept that quiet," he said. "I know." He studied me for a moment. Then he nodded. "Tell me what you need." That was the first shift. Over the next 3 months, we rebuilt client by client, smaller contracts, leaner margins, more personal calls than I could count. In January, something unexpected happened. My father called. Not to argue, not to threaten, to meet. We sat in a diner off Route 9. Vinyl booths, burnt coffee. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You think I wanted this?" he asked quietly. "I don't know what you wanted," I replied. "I wanted you to earn it," he said, "not inherit it." "I did earn it." Silence. He looked down at his hands. "When my father handed you control, it felt like he was saying I failed." I hadn't considered that, not fully. "You didn't fail," I said. "You just needed someone to slow you down." He gave a humorless laugh. And that someone was my kid. We sat there with decades of pride between us. "I'm not your enemy," I said finally. "Then stop treating me like I'm dangerous." The words hung there, because maybe in business he was, but in life, he was just a man who built something and didn't know how to let go. By March, we signed 2 new regional contracts, not as large as the one we lost, but steady, cash flow stabilized, layoffs avoided. One afternoon, I found my father standing in the warehouse, watching a shipment being loaded. "You still consulting?" I asked. "For now," he said. Then he added, almost reluctantly, You handled it well. That was the closest thing to approval I'd heard in a year. We're not healed, not fully. Family dinners are cautious, conversations measured. But the company is stronger than it was, and I've learned something I didn't understand when I first opened that envelope. Control isn't the same as dominance, it's restraint. It's knowing when to push back and when not to. Would I have preferred my grandfather trust my father completely? Maybe. Would my father have driven us into the ground without realizing it? Also maybe. If you were in my position, would you have fought your own parent in court to protect a business? Or would you have walked away and let blood outweigh responsibility? And if you've ever had to become the boundary in your own family, how did you live with that choice afterward? I didn't want a war. I wanted stability. Sometimes those look the same from the outside, but they feel very different when you're the one standing at the head of the table.